The shovel struck something hard beneath the frozen Kansas soil, something that shouldn't have been there, something that would make Dr. Edmund Hartwell wish he had never accepted the university's request to investigate the Blackwood farmstead. It was December 15th, 1878, and the bitter prairie wind howled across the abandoned property like the dying breath of something ancient and malevolent. Hartwell's hands trembled not from the cold, but from what he had just unearthed. The wooden box, no larger than a child's coffin, bore strange symbols carved deep into its surface, symbols that seemed to writhe and shift in the flickering lantern light. But it wasn't the box that made his blood run cold. It was what lay beside it. 4 identical graves, perfectly aligned, each marked with a simple wooden cross. The dates were all the same, November 13th, 1878. The names were different, but the surname was consistent: Blackwood. 4 brothers, all dead on the same day. Yet according to the town records, the Blackwood brothers had been seen alive just 3 days ago. Hartwell's assistant, young Thomas Cleary, dropped his own shovel and staggered backward. "Professor," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the wind, "look at the names again." And that's when Hartwell saw it. The dates of birth on each cross, they were all wrong, impossibly wrong. According to the crude wooden markers, each brother had been born on the exact same day, February 29th, 1844. But that was impossible. No woman could give birth to 4 separate children on the same day, unless ... Unless they weren't separate children at all, the wind suddenly died, leaving an unnatural silence that pressed against their eardrums like a physical weight. And in that silence, they heard it a sound that would haunt their dreams for the rest of their lives. The sound of 4 voices speaking in perfect unison, calling out from somewhere deep beneath the frozen earth. Why did you dig us up? But how could 4 men, buried side by side, speak as one? And why did the scientific community refuse to acknowledge what Dr. Hartwell documented that night? Why do the archives at the University of Kansas remain sealed to this day? Tonight, we delve into one of the most disturbing and systematically suppressed cases in American history, a case that challenges everything we think we know about the nature of human existence itself. Kansas in 1878 was a land of endless horizons and bitter winters, where the promise of prosperity drew desperate families to carve out new lives from the unforgiving prairie. The Blackwood farmstead sat 12 miles southeast of Lawrence, positioned on a slight rise that gave it a commanding view of the surrounding wheat fields. To the casual observer, it seemed like any other homestead, a modest wooden house, a small barn, and the geometric precision of cultivated land stretching toward the horizon. But the locals knew better. They had always known there was something wrong with the Blackwood place. The land itself carried a reputation that predated the brothers' arrival by decades. According to Kaw Indian oral histories, the area had been considered taboo, a place where the spirits of the dead walked too close to the world of the living. The tribal elders spoke of strange lights that danced above the ground on moonless nights, and of animals that refused to graze in the shadow of the small hill where the Han farmhouse now stood. When the Kansas-Nebraska Act opened the territory to settlement, the land remained unclaimed for years. Prospective homesteaders would arrive, survey the rich soil, and then inexplicably choose plots miles away, despite the obvious advantages of the elevated position. Those few who did attempt to establish claims found themselves plagued by inexplicable misfortunes: livestock dying without cause, crops failing despite ideal conditions, and a persistent sense of being watched by unseen eyes. It was only in the spring of 1875 that the 4 Blackwood brothers arrived in Lawrence, claiming the abandoned homestead as their own. The townspeople still remember that day with uncomfortable clarity. The brothers had appeared at the land office just as the sun reached its zenith, moving with an odd, synchronized precision that made the clerk's skin crawl. They spoke in turns, but their voices carried the same inflections, the same cadence, as if they were reading from the same invisible script. Marcus Blackwood, the eldest, stood precisely 6 feet tall with dark hair and penetrating gray eyes. His voice, when he spoke, carried an authority that seemed to command immediate attention. Beside him, Matthew Blackwood possessed identical features, save for a small scar above his left eyebrow, a mark that seemed to appear and disappear depending on the light. The third brother, Michael, was indistinguishable from his siblings, except for the way he held his head slightly tilted, as if perpetually listening to something no one else could hear. And finally, Martin Blackwood, the youngest, who never spoke at all, but whose presence seemed to fill the room with an inexplicable chill. The land clerk, Harold Finnegan, later described the encounter to anyone who would listen. They filled out the paperwork in perfect synchronization, he would say, his hands shaking as he poured another whiskey. One would write a word, then the next would continue the sentence, then the next, and so on. But the handwriting never changed. It was as if the same hand was writing through all 4 of them. More disturbing still was their lack of proper documentation. No birth certificates, no previous addresses, no records of their existence before that spring day in 1875. When pressed for details about their background, Marcus simply smiled an expression that failed to reach his eyes and explained they were from the East, though he could provide no specifics about which eastern state or territory. The brothers paid for their land, claim in gold coins Spanish pieces of 8 that hadn't been common currency for decades. When Finnegan examined the coins more closely, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. The dates on the coins were all from the future. Several bore the year 1879, though it was still 1875. Despite these irregularities, the claim was processed. The brothers thanked Finnegan with identical nods and left the office in single file, their footsteps creating a rhythmic echo that seemed to linger long after they had departed. Within days of their arrival at the farmstead, strange reports began filtering back to Lawrence. Travelers passing the property at night spoke of seeing lights in the windows that moved in perfect geometric patterns. The mail carrier, a practical man named Joseph Clemens, reported that the brothers would often be seen working in the fields. At midnight, their movements eerily synchronized as they tended crops that seemed to grow with unnatural vigor, but it was the disappearance of the livestock that truly unsettled the neighboring farmers. Cattle and horses would vanish from fields adjacent to the Blackwood property, leaving behind no tracks, no signs of struggle, and no trace of blood. The animals would simply cease to exist, as if they had been erased from reality itself. Dr. Cornelius Whitmore, the town's only physician, was called to examine several farmers who claimed to have fallen ill after venturing too close to the Blackwood property. His notes, preserved in the Lawrence Historical Society archives, described symptoms that defied medical explanation: temporary blindness that lasted exactly 4 hours, a complete loss of taste and smell that persisted for 4 days, and a peculiar form of amnesia that wiped away exactly 4 years of memory. The pattern of 4s was unmistakable, though Dr. Whitmore could find no rational explanation for a dot. As the months passed, the brothers established a routine that became legendary among the local population. They would appear in Lawrence every 4th Tuesday, arriving at precisely noon and departing at exactly 4 o'clock. They would visit the same 4 establishments in the same order: the general store, the bank, the church, and the cemetery. At each location, they would conduct their business with mechanical efficiency, speaking only when necessary, and always in the same measured tones. The townspeople began to time their own activities to avoid encountering the brothers. Shopkeepers would find excuses to step out when they saw the 4 men approaching. Children would be called indoors, and even the stray dogs that roamed the streets would slink away, whimpering softly. But it was their visits to the cemetery that disturbed people most. The brothers would spend exactly 1 hour among the graves, not visiting any particular plot, but simply standing in perfect formation at the cemetery's center. They would remain motionless, their eyes closed, their breathing synchronized, as if they were participating in some silent ritual that transcended the boundaries of death itself. Cemetery. Groundskeeper Benjamin Morse reported that after each visit, fresh flowers would appear on graves that had been neglected for years. But these weren't ordinary flowers. They were species that didn't exist in Kansas. Plants that seemed to glow with their own inner light and never wilted. Regardless of the season or weather, the flowers would remain fresh for exactly 4 days, then crumble to dust without warning by the winter of 1878. The entire county had developed an unspoken agreement to avoid the Blackwood property. The brothers had become local legends, whispered about in hushed tones around dinner tables and in the corners of saloons. Children would dare each other to approach the farmstead, but none were ever brave enough to actually do so. It was in this atmosphere of growing unease that the University of Kansas received an anonymous letter, postmarked from Lawrence and written in 4 different handwritings that somehow formed a single, coherent message. The letter requested that the university send a qualified researcher to investigate certain phenomena at the Blackwood farmstead. The letter was signed simply the brothers and included a substantial sum of money to cover all expenses. Dr. Edmund Hartwell, professor of natural philosophy and the university's most respected investigator of unusual phenomena, was selected for the assignment. He had made his reputation debunking supposed supernatural occurrences, applying rigorous scientific methodology to separate fact from folklore. He had no idea that his investigation would uncover something far more terrifying than any ghost story. Dr. Hartwell's first encounter with the Blackwood brothers occurred on November 1st, 1878, exactly 12 days before their mysterious deaths. He had arranged to meet them at their farmstead to discuss the nature of their request, expecting to find the typical rural family plagued by overactive imaginations and local superstitions. Instead, he discovered something that challenged his understanding of human nature itself. The brothers were waiting for him in the front yard, standing in perfect formation as his carriage approached. They wore identical black suits despite the informality of farm life, and their positioning created a precise square with each man exactly 4 feet from his neighbors. As Hartwell's carriage wheels crunched across the frozen ground, all 4 men turned their heads in unison, their movements so synchronized that they seemed to be controlled by a single consciousness. Dr. Hartwell, Marcus spoke first, his voice carrying across the still air with unnatural clarity. "We have been expecting you." "Indeed," continued Matthew, picking up the sentence without pause. "Your reputation precedes you." "As does your skepticism," added Michael, his head still tilted at that peculiar angle. Martin, the youngest, remained silent but smiled, the same cold expression that failed to reach his eyes. Hartwell dismounted from his carriage, his scientific training warring with an inexplicable sense of dread. "Gentlemen," he said, forcing his voice to remain steady, "I understand you have some phenomena you'd like me to investigate?" The brothers exchanged glances, a complex communication that seemed to occur without words. Then Marcus stepped forward, breaking the geometric formation for the first time since Hartwell's arrival. "Dr. Hartwell," Marcus said, his gray eyes reflecting the overcast sky, "what would you say if I told you that the boundary between life and death is thinner than most people believe?" Before Hartwell could respond, Matthew continued the thought. "And what if I told you that some families are born to walk that boundary? That some bloodlines carry secrets that science refuses to acknowledge?" Michael added. Martin's smile widened, but he said nothing. Hartwell pulled out his notebook, a gesture that had become automatic after years of research. I would say that such claims require extraordinary evidence. Perhaps you could show me these phenomena you mentioned in your letter? Brothers' synchronized laughter sent chills down Hartwell's spine. It wasn't the sound of four men laughing. It was the sound of one voice emerging from four throats, creating harmonies that shouldn't have been possible. "Follow us," Marcus said, and the brothers reformed their perfect square formation before. Moving toward the farmhouse, the interior of the Blackwood home defied Hartwell's expectations. Despite the crude exterior, the inside was furnished with expensive pieces that seemed to belong in a wealthy Eastern mansion rather than a Kansas farmstead. Persian rugs covered the wooden floors, and the walls were lined with books written in languages Hartwell couldn't identify. But it was the photographs that truly unsettled him. Covering every available surface were daguerreotypes and tintypes spanning what appeared to be several decades. The photographs showed the same four faces at different ages, in different settings, wearing the clothing of different eras. Some appeared to be from the 1840s, others from the 1850s, and a few seemed even older. But the faces never changed. Marcus, Matthew, Michael, and Martin Blackwood looked exactly the same in every photograph, as if they had been frozen in time. "Family portraits," Marcus explained, noticing Hartwell's intense examination of the images. "We've always been close." "Very close," Matthew added. "Closer than most families," Michael continued. Martin nodded silently, his perpetual smile never wavering. Hartwell picked up one of the daguerreotypes, studying the faces with growing unease. "This photograph appears to be from the 1840s, yet you all look exactly as you do today. How is that possible?" The brothers exchanged their wordless communication. Again before Marcus answered, "Time affects different families in different ways. Dr. Hartwell, some age quickly, others don't age at all." "But that's impossible," Hartwell protested. "Human physiology doesn't work that way." "Human physiology," Matthew repeated, emphasizing the word human in a way that made Hartwell's skin crawl. "Yes," Michael agreed. "Human physiology." Martin's smile disappeared entirely, replaced by an expression of profound sadness. The brothers led Hartwell through the house, showing him room after room of identical furniture, arranged in perfect symmetry. Each bedroom contained 4 beds, positioned to form a square. The kitchen had 4 of everything: 4 chairs, 4 plates, 4 cups, 4 sets of utensils, all arranged with mathematical precision. But it was the basement that truly disturbed him. The cellar had been excavated far deeper than any normal farmhouse would require, extending at least 20 feet below ground level. The walls were lined with smooth river stones, arranged in patterns that seemed to shift and flow in the lamplight. And at the center of the space stood a circular table made from black wood, its surface carved with the same symbols Hartwell would later discover on the mysterious wooden box. "This is where we conduct our research," Marcus explained. "Research into what?" Hartwell asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. "The nature of consciousness," Matthew replied. "The relationship between the individual and the collective," Michael added. "The possibility of shared existence," Marcus continued. Martin placed his hand on the table's surface, and the carved symbols began to glow with a soft, pulsing light. Hartwell stumbled backward, his scientific rationalism crumbling in the face of what he was witnessing. "What are you?" he whispered. The brothers spoke in unison, their voices creating harmonies that seemed to come from somewhere beyond the physical world. "We are what remains when 4 becomes 1, and 1 becomes 4. The symbols on the table pulsed brighter, and Hartwell felt his consciousness being pulled toward something vast and incomprehensible. For a moment, he experienced what it might be like to exist as multiple beings sharing a single awareness, to feel the boundaries of individual identity dissolving into something larger and more terrifying. Then the light faded, and he was alone. In the basement, the brothers had vanished. Hartwell ran up the stairs, his heart pounding, calling out for the brothers. But the house was empty. More than empty, it was as if the brothers had never existed at all. The photographs had disappeared from the walls. The expensive furniture had been replaced by crude wooden pieces, and the basement had been filled with ordinary farm equipment. Only the smell remained, a bosy, faint odor of something ancient and otherworldly. That seemed to cling to his clothes and hair. Hartwell spent the night in Lawrence, trying to rationalize what he had experienced. Perhaps it had been a hallucination brought on by stress or illness. Perhaps the brothers had simply been clever fraudsters, using tricks and illusions to fool him. But deep down, he knew that what he had witnessed transcended any earthly explanation. Next morning, he returned to the farmstead, determined to conduct a proper scientific investigation. But the brothers were nowhere to be found. The house stood empty, its windows dark, and no smoke rose from the chimney. For the next 11 days, Hartwell maintained a vigil at the property, documenting every detail, measuring every room, and searching for any evidence of the phenomena he had witnessed. He found traces scorch marks on the basement floor where the table had stood, indentations in the soil outside that formed perfect geometric patterns, and a persistent electromagnetic anomaly that made his compass spin wildly. But he found no sign of the brothers themselves. Then, on the morning of November 13th, everything changed. Hartwell was awakened by the sound of digging. He had been sleeping in his carriage, parked near the farmhouse, when the rhythmic scraping of shovels against frozen earth pulled him from his dreams. He checked his pocket watch. It was exactly 3:33 a.m. 4 figures moved through the darkness. Behind the house, their shovels rising and falling in perfect synchronization. Even in the dim starlight, Hartwell could see that they were digging 4 graves, each one precisely the same size and depth, arranged in the familiar square formation. The brothers had returned. Hartwell crept closer, using the shadows to mask his approach. The brothers worked in complete silence, their movements mechanical and purposeful. They showed no signs of fatigue despite the frozen ground, and their breathing remained steady and synchronized even as they dug deeper. As dawn approached, the brothers completed their work. 4 graves, each exactly 6 feet deep and 3 feet wide, positioned with mathematical precision. They placed their shovels aside and stood at the edge of their excavation, looking down into the darkness they had created, and they began to speak, their voices weaving together in a language that predated human civilization. 4 paths converge upon this night, 4 souls prepared for final flight, 4 bodies yield to Earth's embrace, 4 MINDs transcend both time and space. The words sent vibrations through the ground that Hartwell could feel in his bones. The air itself seemed to thicken, becoming difficult to breathe, and the temperature dropped so rapidly that frost began forming on the brothers' clothing. Marcus was the first to step forward, positioning himself at the edge of the first grave. "I release this flesh," he said, his voice carrying a finality that made Hartwell's blood run cold. Matthew moved to the second grave. "I release this form," he continued. Michael took his place at the third grave. "I release this identity," he added. Martin, silent as always, simply stepped to the 4th grave and nodded. Then, in a movement that defied every law of physics Hartwell knew, the brothers began to sink into the earth, not falling, not being pulled down, but simply descending as if the solid ground had become as insubstantial as water. They sank slowly, their eyes never leaving each other's faces, their expressions peaceful and resolved. As they descended, their bodies began to change. The boundaries between them became less distinct, as if they were merging into a single entity. Their features blurred and shifted, creating impossible geometries that hurt to look at directly. the air filled with a sound like breaking glass, and the electromagnetic anomaly that had been affecting Hartwell's compass intensified to the point where his pocket watch stopped working entirely. The brothers continued to sink until only their heads remained above ground level. They spoke one final time, their voices now completely unified. "We are the four who became one. We are the one who became four. We are the bridge between what is and what might be. We are the answer to the question that science refuses to ask." Then they were gone, swallowed by the earth as if they had never existed. The graves filled themselves, the soil flowing like water until the ground was level once more. 4 wooden crosses materialized from the darkness, each one bearing the names and dates that Hartwell would discover weeks later. The electromagnetic anomaly ceased, and the natural sounds of the prairie returned. The whisper of wind through grass, the distant cry of a night bird, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. Hartwell stood alone in the gray dawn light, trying to process what he had witnessed. His scientific mind rebelled against the evidence of his senses, but he could not deny what he had seen. 4 human beings had deliberately buried themselves alive, and the earth had accepted them as if they belonged there. He spent the rest of the day documenting everything, measuring the graves, sketching the site, and recording every detail in his notebook. But when he returned to Lawrence and attempted to report his findings, he discovered that his problem was just beginning. Nobody believed him. The townspeople, who had lived in fear of the Blackwood brothers for 3 years, now claimed they had never existed. The land office had no record of the brothers' claim. The bank had no record of their transactions. Even the cemetery groundskeeper, Benjamin Morse, denied ever seeing the brothers during their monthly visits. Was as if the brothers had been erased from history itself. Hartwell knew what he had seen. He had the evidence in his notebook, the measurements of the graves, the documentation of the electromagnetic anomalies. He had proof that something extraordinary had occurred at the Blackwood farmstead. He just couldn't get anyone to listen. The University of Kansas initially supported his research, but when he submitted his official report, the reaction was swift and devastating. His colleagues dismissed his findings as the product of stress-induced hallucinations. His superiors questioned his mental state and suggested he take a leave of absence. The university's board of trustees quietly removed him from his position and buried his report in the archives, where it remains sealed to this day. Dr. Hartwell spent the remaining years of his life trying to find someone who would take his story seriously. He wrote letters to universities across the country, submitted articles to scientific journals, and even contacted newspaper reporters. But everywhere he turned, he found the same response: polite skepticism followed by complete dismissal. Scientific community had made its decision. The Blackwood brothers had never existed, and Dr. Hartwell's report was the product of a disturbed mind. But Hartwell never stopped believing in what he had witnessed. His personal journals, discovered after his death in 1892, contained detailed drawings of the symbols he had seen, measurements of the farmstead, and theories about the nature of consciousness that were decades ahead of their time. Most disturbing of all, his final journal entry, dated just 3 days before his death, contained a single line written in 4 different handwritings: "We are still here." The truth about the Blackwood brothers might have died with Dr. Hartwell, buried beneath decades of academic denial and faded memories. But in 1923, 45 years after their mysterious disappearance, a construction crew working on a new railway line made a discovery that would forever change our understanding of the case. The railroad company had purchased the land where the sea Blackwood farmstead once stood, intending to run their tracks directly through the site. The farmhouse had long since been demolished, and the property had been abandoned for decades. Local residents had forgotten about the brothers, and the land had reverted to wild prairie grass and scattered trees. But the earth remembered. When the construction crew began excavating for the railroad bed, their steam shovels struck something unusual about 6 feet below the surface. At first, they assumed it was just another collection of rocks, or perhaps the remains of an old foundation. But as they dug deeper, they realized they had uncovered something far more disturbing. It was a wooden box, roughly 3 feet long and 2 feet wide, constructed from a type of wood that the railroad's consulting botanist couldn't identify. The box was covered in intricate carvings that seemed to shift and move in the lantern light, creating optical illusions that made the workers' eyes water and their heads spin. But it wasn't the box itself that stopped the construction project cold. It was what they found around it. 4 skeletons, arranged in a perfect square with the wooden box at their center. The bones were pristine, showing no signs of decay despite having been buried for nearly half a century. More disturbing still, the skeletons were positioned in a way that suggested they had died holding hands, their finger bones interlaced in a gesture of unity that had persisted beyond death. The railroad supervisor, a practical man named James Morrison, immediately contacted the local authorities. Sheriff William Hendricks arrived within hours, accompanied by Dr. Robert Kellner, the county coroner. Both men were skeptical of the workers' claims, assuming they had simply uncovered an old family cemetery. But when they examined the remains, they found something that challenged every assumption about the case. The skeletons were identical, not similar, not related, identical. Every bone, every measurement, every distinctive feature was exactly the same. It was as if the same person had died 4 times, or as if 4 bodies had been created from a single template. Dr. Kellner, who had performed hundreds of autopsies during his career, had never seen anything like it. "It's medically impossible," he told Sheriff Hendricks. "Even identical twins show some variation in their skeletal structure. But these ... these are exactly the same." The coroner's initial report, filed with the county clerk on March 15, 1923, documented measurements and findings that defied explanation. The 4 skeletons were all exactly 6 feet tall, with identical bone density, identical tooth structure, and identical wear patterns that suggested they had lived identical lives. But it was the wooden box that truly terrified the investigators. When Dr. Kellner attempted to open the box, he discovered that it had no visible latch or hinge. The wood seemed to be carved from a single piece, with no joints or seams to indicate how it had been constructed. The surface was covered in symbols that neither he nor Sheriff Hendricks could identify, though both men reported feeling dizzy and nauseous after studying them for more than a few minutes. The box also exhibited unusual properties that challenged the laws of physics. Despite being made of wood, it was surprisingly heavy, far heavier than any wooden object of its size should be. When moved, it created a low humming sound that seemed to come from within, as if something inside was vibrating at a frequency just below human hearing. Most disturbing of all, the box was warm to the touch. Despite having been buried in frozen ground for decades. Dr. Kellner decided to contact the University of Kansas, hoping that their anthropology department might be able to shed light on the unusual discovery. But when he mentioned the location of the find, the university's response was immediate and puzzling. They wanted nothing to do with the case. Professor Margaret Thornton, who had recently taken over the anthropology department, was unusually hostile. When Dr. Kellner called to request assistance, "I'm afraid we have no interest in examining those remains," she said, her voice tight with barely concealed anxiety. "I suggest you contact the state authorities and let them handle it." When Dr. Kellner pressed for an explanation, Professor Thornton's response was chilling. "Some things are better left buried, Doctor. I strongly advise you to reinter those remains and forget you ever found them." But Dr. Kellner was a scientist, driven by curiosity and professional obligation. He couldn't simply ignore the most unusual discovery of his career. Against the university's advice, he decided to examine the wooden box more thoroughly. That decision would prove to be the last mistake of his life. On the evening of March 18, 1923, Dr. Kellner took the wooden box to his private laboratory, determined to find a way to open it and examine its contents. He had invited 3 colleagues to witness the examination: Dr. Samuel Worth, a physician from Kansas City; Professor Charles Brennan, a physicist from the University of Missouri; and Father Timothy O'Brien, a Catholic priest with expertise in ancient languages. The 4 men gathered in Dr. Kellner's laboratory as the sun set over the prairie. The wooden box sat on the examination table, its carved symbols seeming to writhe and shift in the gaslight. All 4 men reported feeling uneasy in its presence, but their scientific curiosity overcame their instinctive fear. Dr. Kellner had spent the previous day researching methods for opening sealed containers, and he had concluded that the box must have some kind of hidden mechanism. He began examining the carvings more closely, pressing and manipulating them in hopes of finding a trigger. At exactly 9:47 p.m., he succeeded. One of the symbols, a complex geometric pattern that seemed to fold in on itself, suddenly depressed under his touch. The box emitted a sound like a sigh, and the lid simply vanished, revealing an interior that shouldn't have been possible. The inside of the box was larger than the outside. Father O'Brien crossed himself and began muttering prayers in Latin. Professor Brennan stared at the impossible geometry, his understanding of physics crumbling. Dr. Worth reached for his medical bag, convinced that they were all suffering from some kind of mass hallucination. But Dr. Kellner leaned forward, peering into the box's interior, drawn by scientific curiosity despite his growing fear. The inside of the box contained what appeared to be a small room, complete with walls, floor, and ceiling. At the center of this impossible space sat a single object, a leather-bound journal, its pages filled with handwriting that seemed to glow with its own inner light. Dr. Kellner reached into the box and grasped the journal. The moment his fingers touched its surface, the world around him exploded into chaos. The laboratory filled with light, not the warm glow of gaslight, but something cold and alien that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The 4 men found themselves surrounded by figures that defied description, shapes that suggested human form but possessed too many limbs, too many eyes, too many mouths speaking in harmonious voices. And at the center of it all stood 4 familiar faces: Marcus, Matthew, Michael, and Martin Blackwood, exactly as they had appeared in 1878, but somehow more than human, as if they had become something beyond the limitations of individual existence. Dr. Kellner, Marcus spoke, his voice carrying. Across dimensions, we have been waiting for you. Waiting for someone brave enough to open the box, Matthew continued. Waiting for someone who would understand, Michael added. Martin smiled his eternal smile and extended his hand toward the terrified coroner. The journal in Dr. Kellner's hands began to burn, not with fire, but with knowledge, a searing flood of information that revealed the true nature of the Blackwood brothers and their connection to forces beyond human comprehension. He learned that they were not brothers at all, but fragments of a single consciousness that had been divided across 4 bodies as part of an experiment in transcendence. He learned that their deaths in 1878 had been a metamorphosis, a transformation, that allowed them to exist simultaneously in multiple dimensions. He learned that the wooden box was an anchor point, a way for them to maintain contact with the physical world while exploring realms of existence that most humans couldn't even imagine. And he learned that by opening the box, he had become part of their eternal experiment. The last thing Dr. Kellner remembered was the feeling of his consciousness expanding, multiplying, becoming something more than human. He felt himself dividing, becoming not one person but 4, each sharing his memories, but experiencing reality from a different perspective. Then everything went dark. Sheriff Hendricks arrived at the laboratory the next morning. Responding to reports of strange lights and sounds, he found 4 bodies arranged in a perfect square around the examination table. Dr. Kellner, Dr. Worth, Professor Brennan, and Father O'Brien were all dead, their faces peaceful but their eyes wide open, staring at something beyond the physical world. The wooden box was gone, along with the 4 skeletons that had been discovered at the railroad site. In their place, Sheriff Hendricks found only 4 business cards, each bearing the same message in elegant script. The Blackwood brothers, consultants in matters beyond science. The cards were dated March 19, 1923, the day after Dr. Kellner's death. The official cause of death was listed as simultaneous heart failure, though the coroner who performed the autopsies privately admitted that he had never seen anything like it. All 4 men had died at exactly the same moment, their hearts stopping in perfect synchronization. But the most disturbing discovery came when the new coroner examined the bodies more closely. Like the skeletons found at the railroad site, the 4 dead men showed identical signs of decomposition, as if they had all died the same death in the same way. The railroad company quietly canceled their construction project and sold the land to a private buyer who promised to leave it undisturbed. The University of Kansas sealed all records related to the case, and the surviving families of the 4 dead men were paid substantial sums to avoid talking to reporters. Once again, the scientific community had made its decision. The Blackwood case would be forgotten, buried beneath layers of bureaucracy and academic denial. But some truths are too persistent to remain hidden forever. The official story ends there, with 4 more unexplained deaths and a case that the scientific community refuses to acknowledge. But the truth, as it often does, has a way of surfacing in unexpected places. In 1952, nearly 30 years after the laboratory incident, a graduate student named Ellen Morrison was researching her thesis on 19th century settlement patterns in Kansas when she discovered something that changed everything. While examining deed records in the Lawrence County Courthouse, she found a document that shouldn't have existed, a land transfer dated March 20, 1923, just 1 day after Dr. Kellner's death. The document transferred ownership of the former Blackwood property to a company called Transcendental Research Associates, and it was signed by 4 individuals: M. Blackwood, Blackwood, M. Blackwood, and M. Blackwood. The handwriting was identical on all 4 signatures, and the document had been witnessed by 4 men whose descriptions matched Dr. Kellner and his colleagues exactly. But according to official records, all 4 witnesses were already dead when the document was signed. Ellen Morrison tried to research Transcendental Research Associates, but the company seemed to exist in a bureaucratic limbo. It had no registered address, no tax records, no employees, and no business license. Yet somehow, it legally owned one of the most infamous pieces of land in Kansas. Morrison's investigation might have ended there, but she made a discovery that would haunt her for the rest of her life. While searching through old newspaper archives, she found a small classified advertisement that appeared in the Lawrence Daily Journal World every 4th Tuesday, without fail, for the past 74 years. The ad was simple, almost mundane. 4. Brothers seek individuals interested in transcendental research. Serious inquiries only. Apply in person at sunset. Coordinates 38.9517N, 95.2353. Ask for M. Blackwood. The coordinates led to the exact location of the original Blackwood farmstead. Morrison's thesis advisor, Dr. Richard Hartwell, grandson of the original Dr. Edmund Hartwell, tried to dissuade her from pursuing the story. Some family legacies are better left alone, he warned her, his hands trembling as he spoke. My grandfather spent his entire life trying to forget what he saw out there. It destroyed him. But Morrison was young, ambitious, and driven by the same scientific curiosity that had doomed so many before her. On a cold Tuesday evening in November 1952, exactly 74 years after the brothers' original disappearance, she drove to the coordinates listed in the advertisement. The farmstead was gone, replaced by an empty field that seemed to absorb sound and light. But as the sun set over the prairie, Morrison saw them 4 figures standing in the exact spot where the house had once been. They wore modern clothes, but their faces were unmistakable. Marcus, Matthew, Michael, and Martin Blackwood, unchanged. By the passage of time, Dot Morrison approached them, her heart pounding, but her academic training keeping her focused. "I'm here about the advertisement," she called out. The brothers turned toward her in unison, their synchronized movement as unsettling as it had been in 1878. Marcus stepped forward, his gray eyes reflecting the dying light. "Miss Morrison," he said, his voice carrying the same authority it had possessed decades earlier. "We've been expecting you." "Your research has been impressive," Matthew continued. "Your dedication to the truth is admirable," Michael added. Martin smiled his eternal smile and nodded approvingly. "What do you want?" Morrison asked, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. The brothers exchanged their wordless communication before Marcus answered. "We want what we've always wanted, to push the boundaries of human understanding, to explore the spaces between life and death, between individual consciousness and collective existence. But we need help," Matthew continued. "We need researchers, scientists, individuals willing to question the limitations that society imposes on knowledge. We need people like you," Michael added. Morrison felt the same pull that had drawn Dr. Hartwell into their web, the irresistible attraction of forbidden knowledge. "What would that involve?" "A partnership," Marcus replied. "We provide the phenomena. You provide the documentation. Together, we can prove that consciousness is not limited to individual bodies, that death is not the end of existence, that reality is far more malleable than most people believe." "And if I refuse?" The brothers' synchronized laughter echoed across the empty field. "Then you'll go back to your university, finish your thesis, and live a perfectly normal life. But you'll always wonder what you might have learned if you'd been brave enough to take the next step." Morrison stood at the crossroads of her life, faced with a choice that would define her future. She could walk away, return to the safety of conventional academic research, and try to forget what she had seen. Or she could step into the unknown, following the path that had led Dr. Hartwell and Dr. Kellner to their doom yacht. She chose knowledge. The next morning, Morrison's advisor found her dormitory room empty. Her research materials were gone, her thesis abandoned, and her car was missing from the parking lot. A search of the Blackwood property revealed nothing, no trace of Morrison, no evidence of the brothers, no sign that anything unusual had occurred. But the classified advertisement continued to appear in the Lawrence Daily Journal World. Now, with a slight modification, 4 brothers and 1 sister seek individuals interested in transcendental research. Serious inquiries only. Apply in person at sunset. Coordinates 38.9517N, 95.2353W. Ask for M. Blackwood. Over the decades that followed, other researchers disappeared. Dr. James Chun, a physicist from MIT, vanished in 1967 after investigating reports of temporal anomalies at the Blackwood site. Professor Sarah Williams, a consciousness researcher from Stanford, disappeared in 1983. Dr. Michael Torres, a quantum theorist from Harvard, was last seen in 1991, driving toward the coordinates listed in the advertisement. Each disappearance was followed by a subtle change in the classified ad, adding N1 brother or N1 sister to the description. The group was growing, expanding, recruiting new members into their eternal experiment, but they were careful to avoid attracting too much attention. The disappearances were spaced years apart, and the missing researchers were always loners individuals, without strong family ties or institutional connections that might trigger extensive investigations. The scientific community, as it always had, chose to ignore the pattern. Missing persons cases were the domain of law enforcement, not academic institutions. The universities quietly closed the researchers' files, redistributed their funding, and moved on to more conventional projects. Today, in 2025, the classified advertisement still appears in the Lawrence Daily Journal World every fourth Tuesday. The count has grown to 4 brothers and 17 sisters, suggesting that the Blackwood Collective has expanded far beyond its original quartet. But what are they working toward? What is the ultimate goal of their transcendental research? Answer may lie in the testimonies of those brave enough to visit the coordinates, but wise enough to leave before sunset. These witnesses, interviewed anonymously over the decades, describe seeing a structure that shouldn't exist, a massive facility that appears to occupy the same space as the empty field, visible only from certain angles and only during specific times of day. The building seems to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously, its architecture defying conventional physics. Witnesses describe corridors that loop back on themselves, rooms that are larger inside than outside, and windows that show views of impossible landscapes. Inside this facility, according to the testimonies, the collective continues its work. They study the nature of consciousness, map the boundaries between life and death, and explore the possibility of existence beyond the limitations of individual identity. Some witnesses report seeing laboratories filled with equipment that resembles number-known technology, where experiments are conducted on the fundamental nature of reality itself. Others describe vast libraries containing books written in languages that predate human civilization, filled with knowledge that could revolutionize our understanding of existence. But perhaps most disturbing are the reports of the archive, room filled with the preserved consciousness of everyone who has ever joined the collective. The researchers who disappeared over the decades are still there, still conducting their work, but no longer limited by the constraints of individual human existence. They have become something more than human and something less. The implications are staggering. If the Blackwood Collective has truly discovered a way to transcend individual consciousness, to preserve and expand human awareness beyond the boundaries of death, then they may have solved the greatest mystery of existence itself. But at what cost? And what happens when their research is complete? The answers to these questions remain hidden in the archives of the University of Kansas, sealed away from public scrutiny. The scientific community continues to deny the existence of the Blackwood brothers, dismissing the testimonies as hoaxes and the disappearances as coincidences. But the evidence is mounting. A classified advertisement continues to appear. The disappearances continue to occur. And somewhere in the space between dimensions, the collective continues its work, growing stronger with each new recruit. Perhaps that's why science refuses to study the Blackwood case. Perhaps they understand, on some instinctive level, that some knowledge is too dangerous to pursue. Perhaps they recognize that the Blackwood brothers represent not just a mystery to be solved, but a fundamental threat to the nature of human existence itself. Or perhaps they're simply afraid of what they might discover if they look too closely into the abyss. The choice is yours. You can dismiss this story as elaborate fiction, a tale designed to entertain rather than inform. You can return to your comfortable assumptions about the nature of reality and the limitations of human consciousness. Or you can ask yourself, what if it's true? What if consciousness really can transcend individual existence? What if death is not the end, but merely a transition to something greater? What if the Blackwood brothers are still out there, still recruiting, still expanding their collective understanding of the universe? The Lawrence Daily Journal World is available online now. The classified section is easy to find. And every fourth Tuesday, if you know where to look, you might find an advertisement that will change your life forever. But remember what happened to Dr. Hartwell, Dr. Kellner, and Ellen Morrison. Remember that knowledge comes with a price, and that some questions are better left unanswered. The choice is yours, but choose carefully, because some invitations can't be declined once they've been accepted, and some families never let their members leave. Asterisk, thank you for joining me on this journey into the unknown. If you have your own theories about the Blackwood brothers, or if you've encountered similar phenomena in your own research, I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Remember to like and subscribe for more explorations into the mysteries that science refuses to acknowledge. Asterisk, asterisk, until next time, keep questioning, keep searching, and remember, the truth is often stranger than fiction. Asterisk.